The moment they were captured, they felt something unexpected. It wasn't fear, it wasn't relief, it was confusion. For years, they had been warned that if they ever fell into American hands, they would be humiliated, beaten, or killed. That surrender meant suffering, that the enemy across the ocean was cruel, weak, and hateful. But instead of violence, they were given hot food, clean water, medical care, and something far more unsettling than any weapon: respect. For many German soldiers in World War II, the real shock wasn't losing the war. It was discovering who the enemy really was. Between 1943 and 1945, thousands of German soldiers were transported to the United States as prisoners of war. They came from brutal battlefields: North Africa, Normandy, Eastern Europe. Some had witnessed horrors they would carry for the rest of their lives. Others were barely more than boys. But they all shared the same certainty. On American soil, they would be treated like monsters. That certainty began to collapse on the very first day. The camps didn't look like places of punishment. There were fences, yes. There were armed guards, of course. But there were also rules, clear ones. There was enough food. There were doctors. And something unimaginable for men coming from a collapsing Germany: basic dignity. Many prisoners didn't trust it. They were sure it was a trick, a psychological game, something temporary, something designed to break them later. They waited for it to end. It never did. They ate better than their families back home: fresh bread, meat, coffee. Some prisoners would later say the most shocking thing they saw wasn't kindness itself, but waste. One man wrote that he cried when he saw bread thrown into the trash, not out of anger, out of shame, because he knew that at that exact moment his mother was starving in Germany. Over time, the guards stopped being just guards. They talked, they joked. Sometimes they tried to speak German, badly. Some American soldiers had German ancestry. Others had never met anyone from Europe before. For many prisoners, it was the first time they spoke to someone who didn't hate them simply for the uniform they wore. And that changed everything. They had been taught that Americans were weak, undisciplined, decadent. But what they saw were young men who were confident, well-fed, and absolutely certain they were going to win. Men who didn't need cruelty to prove strength. Years later, one prisoner would summarize that realization with a single sentence: "Only those who are certain of victory can afford mercy." Some prisoners were sent to work on farms: Iowa, Texas, Oklahoma. At first, escape crossed their minds, but it didn't take long to realize how pointless that idea was. Escape to where? They were fed. They were treated fairly. Often they worked without heavy guards watching them. They worked hard, yes, but in return, they received real food, open air, and something many hadn't felt in years: normal life. Farmers noticed something strange. The prisoners sang while they worked. This didn't look like forced labor. It looked like people trying to stay human, far away from the war. In small American towns, something else began to happen. The locals stopped seeing these men as enemies. Some prisoners spoke English. Others learned quickly. There was curiosity on both sides. Children laughed at German accents. The prisoners laughed too. Some watched baseball games for the first time. Others worked in workshops, sawmills, factories. None of this erased what Nazi Germany had done, but it created a separation between ideology and individual, between government and human being. For many prisoners, this realization was painful in an unexpected way. Not because they were mistreated, but because they were treated too well. One soldier from the Afrika Korps remembered Christmas in captivity. He was given a full turkey leg. He couldn't bring himself to eat it. Every bite reminded him of his family back home, starving. That generosity didn't erase guilt. It made it heavier. At the same time, it opened their eyes. They saw factories operating without bombings, cities glowing at night, homes with heating, refrigerators, and abundance. Some prisoners believed it had to be fake, staged, propaganda designed to humiliate them. It took time to accept that this society was real, and slowly, an uncomfortable question began to form. If this was the enemy, what did that say about everything we had been told? When the war ended, many prisoners returned to Germany, a country in ruins, cities destroyed, food scarce, trauma everywhere. But they returned changed. They spoke about Americans with respect, sometimes even reverence. Some didn't stay long at all. They immediately began the process of emigrating back to the country where they had once been prisoners. Many succeeded. They became farmers, mechanics, shop owners, restaurant owners. They married, had children, became citizens. Ironically, the place where they had been captured became the place where they rebuilt their lives. Decades later, these stories kept resurfacing. In the 1990s, an American soldier stationed in Germany rents an apartment. One day, the owner's father walks into the kitchen, sees the American uniform, and suddenly hugs him. The soldier is stunned. Later, he learns the man had been a prisoner of war in the United States, and that he remembered those years as the time he was treated with the most humanity in his entire life. In another story, an American veteran sits on a train in Germany. An older man starts a conversation, then pauses and smiles. "My English is better than your German." He thanks him for American hospitality between 1943 and 1945. The veteran expects hostility. He receives gratitude. Some former prisoners would later say the best years of their lives were spent in Texas. Others met their future wives while working on American farms. Some watched war comedies decades later, laughing at exaggerated caricatures that felt strangely familiar. These stories aren't about glorifying war. They are reminders of how war distorts everything, and how humanity, when it appears in the most unlikely places, leaves scars just as deep. Not every camp was the same. Not every experience was perfect. There were tensions, failures, moments of fear, but the overall pattern remained. Compared to other parts of the world, especially Eastern Europe and the Pacific, the treatment of prisoners in the United States was something many never forgot. Maybe because it wasn't just strategy. It was a message, a demonstration that power doesn't require brutality. Years later, many former prisoners taught their children and grandchildren to never waste food, to respect meals, to understand abundance, not through ideology, through memory, through contrast. They had seen what happens when everything is gone, and what it means when someone chooses to share, even in wartime. For some, captivity became their first real exposure to democracy, individual freedom, and a society that didn't depend on constant fear to function. It didn't erase the past, but it forced them to question the future. And maybe that's the most uncomfortable truth of all. War doesn't end when the shooting stops. It continues inside people, in memories, in comparisons, in questions that never have easy answers. For many German soldiers, Military defeat came alongside an unexpected moral victory by the enemy. A victory achieved not through force, but through example. When asked how he explained it all, one former prisoner answered simply. He said the Americans never needed to prove they were better. They just acted like they knew it. And that changed everything. Maybe that's why, decades later, children and grandchildren still tell these stories. Not to rewrite history, but to remember that even in the darkest conflict the world has ever known, there were moments when humanity won quietly. Moments when the enemy stopped being a monster and became just a man on the other side of the fence.